Last year, I made a video on forgotten 32-bit hidden gems, and I want to make this a yearly thing. So today, we'll be covering games you most likely never played, ranging from cats riding robots to Evangelion clones. So, let's get started! This is Gungage for the PS1, a third-person shooter by Konami where you take on several missions to defeat large monsters. And right off the bat, the game really impresses not just with its excellent graphics, but also incredible music.
Extra energy.
Wow! AAA studios do not make music like this anymore, and we're all poor for it. Anyway, the game is quite simple. Each mission requires you to reach a boss and take it down, and along the way, you'll pick up ammo for special guns and crystals that give you more lives. And as you play the game, you'll also unlock additional characters. But for this playthrough, I only got the main character, Skate. Imagine naming your kid Skate. Oh, Japan, never change. Anyway, this game really is all about the shooting and platforming, and some of the levels can actually be fairly large for a PS1 game, giving you secret paths to explore for extra bonuses. And I also think that the art style is generally beautiful. The bright colors honestly remind me more of a Sega Saturn game than a PS1 game. I don't know, call me crazy, but I just associate this sort of bright art style and peppy music more with the Saturn than I do with the PS1. One issue you might have with this game is that it really desperately needed a modern control scheme. So instead of using the dual analogs to move and aim, you'll have to use the buttons on your controller, which can take a while to get used to. Thankfully, the game seems to realize this, so it never really swarms you with enemies, and most will have some kind of wind-up animation before they actually attack you. Not only that, but you also have an auto-aim feature which greatly helps, especially against the bosses. It's a shame that people sleep so much on this game, because it really needs more love, though I do see some that are starting to wake up to it. But either way, this is an excellent game. So I say, check it out if you can. This is Dark Savior for the Sega Saturn, an isometric action RPG made by the same studio behind the Landstalker games. In this game, you play as Garion, a bounty hunter who is escorting a dangerous monster named Balan to a prison island where it will be incarcerated forever. But Balan escapes and starts eating everyone on the ship, and now it's your job to track it down and stop it. Actually, the game starts with a pretty cool mechanic. See, at the beginning, you're given a timer to reach the monster you need to stop, and this timer has far-reaching consequences. Basically, the entire game will change depending or not where you reach Balan before you hit the 3-minute mark, which, believe me, that's not an easy thing to do. But long story short, the game has 5 major branching paths, which the game calls parallels, and these will completely change not just the main storyline, but also the boss and even which locations you visit. So, for example, if you take too long to reach the captain's cabin in the first area of the game, the plot will now revolve around recapturing Balan. But if you reach the captain on time and defeat Balan, the story will now revolve around the corrupt prison warden and the resistance that seeks to stop him. And if you reach the captain's cabin on time but lose a fight against Balan, then this will trigger yet a different parallel storyline. There are a total of 3 main parallel parallel storylines and an additional 2 minor storylines, the latter of which can go into some really interesting timeline paradoxes. That in of itself already makes this game super unique, but we've just barely gotten started. For one thing, even though this game acts and plays like an action RPG, there's actually very little combat involved. Sure, you'll occasionally be swatting some minor enemies, but most fights are actually closer to a 2D fighting game complete with health bars, special moves, and rounds. And you can even charge a power bar for a super attack. And not only that, but most enemies you fight in this method can also be captured by doing a special attack when the capture prompt appears. And when that happens, not only do you gain bonus experience points, but you can now play as that enemy during battles. So yes, there's also a bit of Pokemon here, which is pretty incredible considering that this game only launched 6 months after Pokemon, so it feels like two studios having the same basic idea at the same time, but implementing it in vastly different ways. And man, I've barely scratched the surface of how weird and unique this game is. Like how there's no actual money in this game. Instead, you need to travel around the world and look for items like chocolates, which you can then trade for better gear and items. And you can also spend experience points to heal up or increase your health bar. And I gotta say, I love the graphics and music of Dark Savior. The bright, colorful graphics are pretty much what I meant when I said that Gungage's art style seemed closer to a Saturn game than a PS1 title. Now, as much as I love Dark Savior, I do feel that it has too many gameplay mechanics with very little thought being given as to their synergy. For example, yes, you can capture enemies, but only Garion can capture them. So if you use someone else, not only will you not be able to capture them, but you'll also miss out on those bonus experience points. And experience points also count towards how many retries you're allowed if you get a game over, so it's often best to not increase your main health bar and instead just save them in case you need more lives. This game is a diamond in the rough, and it's a shame it never got a sequel, because with enough care and attention, it could have been an all-time best. As it is though, it's still a really fun, if flawed experience that I highly recommend. Check it out if you can. This is Anvil of Dawn, a first-person dungeon crawling RPG released for PCs in 1995. The fantasy land of whatever it's called is being invaded by barbarian hordes, with the advisor of that land having a premonition that they will lose the war. So he convinces the princess of the tomato people here that only a hero could save the land. So you get to pick between 5 different heroes, though really, there's not much difference between them other than their initial stats, as everyone can learn every magic spell and wield every weapon in the game. So it's mostly about figuring out what are your preferences for the early game and picking out the avatar you like best. And from there on, you'll travel alone in a wide series of pre-rendered dungeons, and I gotta say, I'm a bit unsure if I like the pre-rendered look of these dungeons. I mean, the art style looks really cool in some places, but not so much in others, though it's definitely a nice throwback to the 3DO era of games. Thankfully though, all your enemies and NPCs are 2D sprites, and these look absolutely incredible, with tons of detail and style. I especially like the death animations for a few of these. Now that is cool. And you also get to fight giant tiki masks for some reason, so that's cool, I guess. I also like how many spells you get to use, even if their location on the UI isn't the best, as I often would end up casting a spell by mistake when I only wanted to turn right. At least your mana will replenish automatically though. I feel Anvil of Dawn is a good game for beginners to the genre, as it's not using any known rulebooks like D&D and instead uses a simple simplified rule set that anyone can pick up and play, while giving you a lot of freedom on how you want to build your character. And because the stats are so simple, it's highly unlikely that you'll end up building a useless character. You're also given an auto map that you can check out at any time, and you can even write notes in it, which is especially useful if you want to create a stockpile of weapons and items on a dungeon. And you'll need them too, because this game does not have any shops or money, so you'll have to make do with what you find in the dungeons. Speaking of which, I also really like the dungeon design, as it's not overly confusing, but it's kept interesting by a variety of traps that feel logical without being obtuse. I do however feel that the game relies a bit too much on pressure pads, many of which require varying degrees of weight to work, which is fine if you're carrying rocks, but not so fine when you have to sacrifice gear to make them work. I also like that progression is non-linear, so you can progress into different dungeons depending on which exit you take, while other times you're given different paths in the overworld, which will lead to different dungeons, and it's up to you to figure out which one you think is best for you. This is honestly a really cool game, and one which I rarely see being mentioned these days. If you're in the mood for a tough dungeon crawler with simplified gameplay mechanics, then this is the one for you. So I say, give it a shot. You might be surprised by how much you end up liking it. This is Retro Force, a shmup by Psygnosis launched for the PS1. The game is a throwback to the 16-bit era of the shmup genre, although this one uses polygons instead of 2D graphics. Aliens are invading the Earth, and you're part of the Retro Force who was sent to stop them, with the team being led by Paris Tetsuo. Man, character names in this video are the gift that just keeps on giving. It's pretty clear that this game was something of a lower budget title when compared to some of Psygnosis' other games, like Wipeout for example. But it oddly ends up working in the game's favor, as it basically means that this is just pure gameplay. So you begin in a modern setting, and as you progress, the aliens warp you back into various points in time, like the Roman period or the Ice Age, where you fight tiki statues. Again? I feel like we have something of a theme in this video. Anyway, you have 4 characters to choose from, and you have 3 main weapon styles and 3 additional bomb styles that you can shift between them at any time. However, you'll have to pick up upgrades to each weapon style, and if you lose a life, you go back to a previous checkpoint, but you get to keep any upgrades you've collected up to that point. Retro Force also has an interesting height mechanic, in which enemies can be placed at any of 3 possible heights, and you need to press a button to go up or down a height level to defeat them. One thing I really find interesting about this game is that it's basically a Euro shmup that mixes Japan's late 90s anime culture with the Euro club scene from that time. So stylistically, it ends up being something really unique regardless of the genre. It's like if you asked a late 90s British club goer what he thinks Japanese nightclubs are like. And well, this is what you get. And yes, I know that Euro shmup is usually something of a derogatory term for the genre, but this one is actually really well made, and shows that Euro shmup devs took the time to learn from a lot of their mistakes from the days of the Amiga. Although, I will say that a few of the sound effects are kinda terrible, so I usually just turn the music volume up. But still, this is a pretty fun game, and I think that it's worth checking out. This is Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon for arcades, a 2D beat-em-up in which you can play as the Sailor Scouts and have to take down foes from the anime. So of course, I went with certified best girl, Sailor Mercury. Each girl has slightly different stats like speed or attack, and I was actually surprised with the variety of attacks you can pull off. You have your normal combo, 2 different types of throws, a special move that clears enemies around you, 3 different types of aerial attacks depending on your momentum, and multiple special attacks. I especially like Mercury here, whose grab maneuver is kicking enemies in the family jewels. As you play the game, you pick up crystals which you can use to activate screen clearing attacks that trigger a 2D animation. And the more crystals you have, the more damage it deals, while also triggering a different type of animation. Add some nice cutscenes to round up the package, and you're left with a pretty fun beat-em-up regardless of whether or not you're a Sailor Moon fan. You even get to trigger Tuxedo Mask to help you out. And yes, he's just as useless here as he was in the anime. Honestly, my only real issue with this game is how bad the music is. I don't know if they got the intern to do it, but it's shockingly bad at times. But other than that, yeah, this is a pretty fun game. And I say, check it out if you can. This is Love and Destroy for the PS1. Or is it Love or Destroy? The game is giving me 2 different titles at the title screen. And this is a mech game by Inti Creates, the Blaster Master and Azure Striker Gunvolt developers? I didn't even know they've been around for this long. And this game is basically, what if Neon Genesis Evangelion had a video game? A good video game. One that is not a visual novel. Okay, fine, you win. So you play as not Shinji Ikari crossed with a hentai main character. And yes, this one's just as mopey as the real one. And angels, I mean monsters, are invading Japan, complete with a similarly sounding but legally distinct soundtrack of the Evangelion anime. And you're suddenly teleported to a special agency that has giant mechs created specifically to fight these monsters, who are piloted by a red-haired tsundere and a blue-haired kudere. And you're then sent on missions to take down these monsters, but your mechs can only stay powered up for 5 minutes. Look, I don't know what to tell you, this is basically Evangelion. So now, you need to pick a girl for each mission. Oh, and also, there's a 3rd blonde girl in this game, but I never picked her. And then you go on missions to defeat the monsters. And I gotta say, I love the vibes of this game. The amount of effort that went into the UI and how the girls tie into the animations is genuinely insane. And I also love this line animation of when the girls take damage or when they have something to say.
Elite program, start.
This is literally the coolest effect I've ever seen in a PS1 game. And I just love the amount of destruction you and your enemies can bring to the city. You're basically as much of a monster as the monsters are fighting. Which, again, it's Evangelion, so yeah, that kinda tracks actually. So, each mech has 3 attack types and gameplay styles. So for example, Not Asuka here is more agile, whereas Not Rei is basically a giant tank. And while some enemies can be taken down by simply attacking them, others will require you to aim for specific body parts, which can be destroyed individually, which will then cripple them. And regardless of whether you win or lose the mission, you'll gain experience and level up, which in turn can also be used to power up your mech. There's also some parts where the game asks you to make a choice, which I assume is about how you wish to romance the girls. But I had no idea what the heck I was doing. As far as I know, this game does not have a translation patch yet, but I'd say that you can get around most of it even without one. I will say though that this is yet another game that really could have used a dual analog control scheme. because you have to use the L and R buttons to aim up, down and sideways, and that can take a while to getting used to. Still, this is a super fun and really unique game, so I say check it out if you can.
Wow, that is delicious. Finally, some good fucking food.
From one mech game to another, this is custom Robo for the N64. Oh, what's that? The N64 isn't 32 bits? Well, actually, it turns out that every N64 game ever made was coded in 32 bits and not 64. So as far as I'm concerned, it counts. Anyway, this is an RPG in which you're a kid in the near future and all the rage is collecting robots which can then be used to fight. For some reason, this concept really took off in Japan around this time. I mean, you had custom Robo, Metabots, and Power Quest all launching pretty much at the same time. Anyway, this is a pretty comfy 2D RPG in which you've just moved into a town and got your first Robo, and now you're off to fighting different folks and be the best at what you do. Combat is done in real time in an arena and it kind of reminds me of Sega's Virtual On. And as you defeat enemies, you unlock new parts for your Robo, which you can change at any time. Not only that, but any parts you unlock or Robo types you fight in the RPG portion can then be unlocked in a separate arcade mode. And not gonna lie, some of these Robo designs are giving me some Mega Man Robot Master vibes, especially this guy. But yeah, if you want a simple, comfy RPG with some cool 3D fighting mechanics, then check out Custom Robo on the N64. You will need a translation patch though, but that's easy enough to find. This is Pulirula, an arcade port for the Sega Saturn. The story is... I have no idea. You're in some sort of fairy tale land, and I guess some bad guys do something bad, and you're going to stop them with your magic staff and wand. The story may sound pretty standard, but the game sure isn't. For one thing, I'm not even sure what genre this is. I guess the closest is a beat-em-up, but that's not quite right either because there are no combos or throws. You just basically hit enemies with your wand or staff, and they turn into animals which you can then collect for points. And at first, this is a fairly standard game, but by level 2, you start seeing some weirdness like this odd ballerina boss that shoots lasers. But from there on, the game just gets progressively weirder. And it culminates with whatever level 3 is, which basically feels like the developers decide to have fun with Microsoft Paint and whatever this is.
Hey, are you coming?
Yeah.
And in case you're wondering, no, the game never bothers to explain what's going on. But yeah, as a game, Pulirula is fun if a little standard, but what really makes it stand out is the weirdness. This game is absolutely carried by its art style and visuals. You even have magical abilities to automatically defeat enemies for you, like how you can summon a luchador in a giant microwave where he'll then proceed to cook your enemies for you. If you're in the mood for something weird, different, and distinctly Japanese, then Pulirula is the game for you. And you know what? This weirdness is so right up my alley. Psychic Force is a 3D fighting game for the PS1 with some really interesting gameplay mechanics. Basically, the game allows you to move in any direction so you can get up close and personal with your foe or shoot fireballs from afar Dragon Ball Z style. What I find it interesting is that because this game is all about quick 3D space movement, a lot of the special moves reflect this. So for example, you have the usual Hadouken style attacks that you see in every fighting game, but you also have attacks that quickly bring you to an enemy's location or teleport away, and even attacks that basically serve as mines, allowing you to trap the field and your enemy along with it if you play your cards right. The game's visuals are pretty good for the PS1, and I definitely dig the late 90s story beats and art style, even if it is super cliche. I would definitely watch an anime show based on this game, and I clearly wasn't the only one with this idea, because sometime later the game would get an OVA based on it, which is kinda surprising because I don't think Psychic Force was ever that popular to begin with. And I also love how terrible the English voice acting is. It does that mid-90s thing where fighting game characters are from different countries, so they have American voice actors put on the worst accents you've ever heard, including a Russian Shota riddled with guilt,
Not again! This power! This disgusting power!
a robot girl who went to the Stika School of Voice Acting,
I, who fight for an ideal world, am like a machine myself. Consider that you have lost to another machine.
and oh no, they're not gonna pull a breakfast at Tiffany's, are they?
You see, we had to use your spirit to make the perfect bionic woman to fight for us.
You what? You mean even my feelings of loyalty to Noah were not my own?
There, Sonia. You've done very well for us, but I'm afraid you've about outlived your usefulness.
Wong! I won't forgive you!
We did 20 takes, and that was the best one.
Oh my god, this would so not fly today. But yeah, voice acting aside, the game is pretty simple but pretty fun. So if you're in the mood for a basic fighting game that is not overly deep but is genuinely fun, check this game out. This is Machines, also known as Machines Built for War by Acclaim. And this is a real-time strategy game for PCs. At first, this seems like a fairly standard late 90s RTS by PC standards. You collect resources, build bases, armies, and attack your enemy's base. And believe it or not, this game got glowing reviews back in the day, especially because of the graphics, which is quite funny because the graphics are probably what aged the worst about Machines. In fact, as an RTS, this is a pretty basic game, as there's only one army and practically no story between levels. So why am I talking about it? Because this RTS has one cool feature that completely sets it aside from other games in the same genre, and that is that it has a button to turn it into a first-person mech game. Yes, you can take control of any of your units and move them however you wish, so this basically ends up being a mix of RTS and first-person mech simulator. I mean, you can even enter your own buildings and place research robots in your labs to have them work. There's really no valid reason to actually do this other than role-playing purposes, but the option is there if you want. But taking over your units and using them for manual combat is a legitimate way of getting ahead in this game, because the enemy AI is super predictable during combat, so you can usually outmaneuver most units. There's even some levels where you're given a handful of units and no bases or resources, and you just need to finish the level with what you're given, and the level design here seems tailor-made to be played in first person. You might notice though that the frame rate leaves a lot to be desired, but this was actually an issue with my recording software, which apparently did not like this mode very much, because the game itself ran fine for me. Apparently, Night Dive Studios now owns the rights to this game, and they even released the source code for free. But as far as I know, there's no patch to optimize the game for modern hardware or with modern controls. So yeah, you can argue that this is nothing more than a middling RTS game with a gimmick, which, yeah, that's exactly what it is. But man, it's a really cool gimmick. And it's worth checking out for that reason alone.
I am under attack.
This is Solatorobo Red the Hunter, an action RPG for the Nintendo DS by CyberConnect 2, a Japanese studio whose entire library consists of decent if unspectacular anime-to-game adaptations, which are then used to fund obscure furry games that are actually really good. Technically, the furry games are all part of the same overarching series, but you can just play any of them separately and enjoy them as is, as there's very little that actually connects them with one another. Anyway, you play as Red, a canine bounty hunter who lives in an airship and has a mech. And I just realized how many mech games there are in this video. I swear this was not intentional. The game's main gimmick is that you can grab anything with your mech and use it to solve puzzles or fight enemies. So for example, you can grab an enemy and throw it onto someone else, or you can grab it while in midair and do combos. You'll also be exploring the world and various towns, gathering quests, side quests, money, leveling up, and buying upgrades for your mech, which are then applied by doing a Tetris-like minigame. And I also like that at times, you'll have to jump out of your mech to enter people's houses and certain locations, and combat is completely different when you're on foot. I also really like the mood and feel of the game. It has a real Mega Man Legends vibe to it, as you're exploring this idyllic world that seems to have been built on the back of a forgotten calamity. And I really love the cutscene design and the way the 2D characters are animated. I will say though that despite me loving everything about this world, characters and writing, I don't really like the main quest. I don't know, it's something about a magical forgotten amulet awakening a giant monster, and people are keeping secrets from you. It's honestly all pretty standard, and I would have preferred something more lighthearted. Another issue I have with this game is that every environment feels small and a little claustrophobic if I'm being honest. So you're always going from area to area, enduring multiple short but consecutive load times. So it does feel like the game was a little held back by technical limitations. But thankfully, the strong points absolutely make up for these small faults, and it's a game that is absolutely worth your time. So I say, check it out if you can. This is Eve Burst Error, a Sega Saturn eroge visual novel that by some miracle actually received a physical English release on PC. And to be fair, I can see why they picked this game, as Eve Burst Error was extremely well received in Japan, spawning multiple sequels and even remakes. So I guess at some point, the developers and publisher were hoping that some of that would rub off in the West. And it's a shame it didn't, because even though I'm not a huge visual novel guy, I genuinely enjoyed this game. Basically, the game takes place across multiple days and you can play between two characters, a down-on-his-luck detective named Kojiro and an intelligence agent named Marina. And the idea is that you have two branching narratives and you'll have to switch between them as they engage in their own seemingly unconnected storylines until you get to the point when you realize that they have more elements in common than first appeared. I really like the characters and their interactions, especially the main girl Kojiro is after. She feels like a believable, realistic, down-to-earth character who is basically going through a midlife crisis, a theme which you don't often see being explored all that well in Japanese games or anime. But here it's completely believable and relatable. And I know it sounds like I just gave the game a backhanded compliment, but that's really not how I meant it. The issue though is that the fact this game got an official English localization was something of a monkey paw scenario, because it felt like the localizers were terrified that us dumb Westerners would simply not be able to enjoy a visual novel. And so they tried to spice it up by literally adding raunchy jokes every 3 lines. Like, I'm not even exaggerating here, there is a sex joke every 3 lines, and it gets really annoying.
お前は柔軟すぎるんだ。汚らしいものは見せなくていい。 お前の操作。
Like, I don't mind this sort of humor, but they went so far with it that it honestly affected the mood and setting of the game. And even though I don't speak Japanese, whenever there's a Japanese voiceover dialogue, you can usually tell what parts the localizer simply added in for humor. Ironically enough, in direct contradiction with everything I just said, a lot of the eroge scenes had their visuals either removed or toned down. So while some of it is still there, a lot of it just didn't make the cut.
Don't come!
Kinda weird how the localizers talk the talk, but then couldn't walk the walk. Fucking cowards, man. If you're into visual novels, there's a decent chance you've heard of Eve Burst Error, as it was a pretty big franchise at some point. But for the rest of us, this is a pretty obscure franchise, and the Western PC version even more so. But I still say, check it out if you can. This is the Firemen 2 Pete and Danny for the PS1, a sequel to the Firemen for the Super Nintendo. The game was only launched in Japan, but thankfully you do not need to speak Japanese to play it. In fact, I've actually finished this game before without ever needing to consult a guide or translation patch. It's the near future and a massive fire breaks out in an amusement park, and now it's up to you to put out the fire and rescue people. Graphically, the game is barely an upgrade over the Super Nintendo game, though this time you can actually play in two-player co-op, something which the SNES prequel did not allow. But of course I don't have any friends, so I'll just be playing alone. But other than that, if you've played the first game, this is basically more of the same. So, as Pete and Danny, you need to put out fires and rescue hostages. And you have two firing modes, one for high fires and the secondary mode which is better suited for low flames. Your AI buddy will also help out as he puts out fires with an axe, and he's surprisingly useful. The cool thing about having this game being set in an amusement park is that you'll be putting out fires in really interesting locations, like amusement rides, aquariums, and even dinosaur exhibits. And because the game is set in the near future, some of the machines will also go haywire and you'll have to take them out. Sometimes it kinda feels like the fire is sentient and specifically targets you, but hey, it's a video game, I can overlook that. I will say though that I prefer taking out the fires over the robots and machines, which just seem like a more interesting and unique enemy for me. And if you have trouble, you can also pick up secondary items like water grenades. I will say though that even though I like this game, I feel the SNES prequel was better. For one thing, this game needs to stop and load almost every room you enter, which kind of breaks the flow of the game. Not only that, but the music will always reset when you do that. Heck, it'll even reset if you pause the game. Additionally, all dialogue in this game is now voice acted, and as a result, it takes a bit more time to get through it compared to the first game where it was simply written text. But these are minor issues to be sure, and if you enjoyed the first one, I highly recommend you check out the second one. Just don't expect any major improvements. This is Starfighter for the 3DO, a flight combat game that is honestly super impressive. The game was originally launched for the Acorn Archimedes, but this 3DO enhanced port is where it's at. So much so that even though it also got PS1 and Sega Saturn ports, everyone basically agrees that the 3DO port is the definitive version. So, this is a mission-based flight combat game, and I like how every map and mission is basically just an open sandbox that lets you do anything you want, however you want to do it. And believe me, this game gives you a lot of freedom. For one thing, everything is destructible, and I mean everything. If you shoot at the ground, it turns to molten lava, and if you come back later, the trees you destroyed or the molten lava you created is still there. And and civilian buildings can also be destroyed, and if they're close enough together, it starts a chain reaction where they keep falling on top of each other and destroy everything around them, which is so freaking cool. Do you see a mountain in front of you? Well, you can actually just shoot the mountain and punch a hole through it as you fly out the other side. That is insane! And if you fly up, the game becomes darker and darker as you reach the edge of space, and if you look down, you have a really impressive draw distance for the 3DO. Like, this game is really impressive. Though, word to the wise, you're better off playing this on an emulator and speeding up the CPU by about 40%. Otherwise, your frame rate is going to start having a lot of issues. Just a little tip for you. But yeah, as you progress through the game, most missions will have you take down targets, protect your mothership, or meet up with fighters. And if you meet up with them, you can give them orders like attacking, defending, or create formations. Though I found the squad controls a little wonky for my taste. The funny thing is that the game is actually super easy, barely an inconvenience. Mostly because you have regenerating health and because you have so much freedom in how you tackle your enemies. For example, instead of shooting at an enemy turret, you can take it out by just firing at the ground below it and deforming it so much that the turret simply explodes, which is such a cool concept. It's kind of insane how the more I learn about the 3DO's library, the more games I discover that I genuinely enjoy. And this is one you should absolutely check out. I swear, the 3DO was done so dirty over the years. This is Wizardry, the Lyllgamyn Saga for the PS1 and Sega Saturn, though I'll be playing the Sega Saturn version, and this is a compilation remake of the first 3 Wizardry games. If you've been following my channel for a while, you probably already know that I'm a huge Wizardry fan, and this release is honestly my go-to way of playing the original trilogy. The first thing I should point out is that even though this version only launched in Japan, the game has an English option right out of the box, so you can play it without any translation patches. And for those who don't know, Wizardry is an old-school dungeon crawling RPG series that led to the creation of the JRPG genre as we know it today. The idea is that you build a party of 6 adventurers and then venture forth on the dungeon fighting enemies, leveling up, collecting gear, and losing your adventurers over and over again. Yes, permadeath is a major feature of the Wizardry series, and it becomes a genuinely tense game when something goes wrong and you're caught off guard, and then you're just desperately trying to survive and claw your way out while saving as many party members as you can before trying again. I tend to go with this version of the original trilogy because it adds a lot of quality of life improvements that help you ease into the game. For one thing, the turning animation helps give you a good sense of direction, something which was missing from most ports. You also have an automap feature, which is immensely useful, especially if you don't have the time to draw your own maps. Although, you can still draw your own maps and ignore the automap feature if you really want to. But perhaps the most useful feature is how this version lets you reroll characters instantly, an action which, believe it or not, can save you hours of tedious character creation process. And because this version has the first trilogy, you can import all your party members across all 3 games. Heck, the Sega Saturn version even has an exclusive campaign, so it's technically 4 games in one. I've heard the exclusive campaign is missing from the PS1 version, but don't quote me on it. I know that there's a remake of the first Wizardry on Steam right now, but I still prefer playing this version simply because I can use my party across all games. So if you want to finally try this series, this is a good way to do it. This is Sanvein, also known as Starfighter Sanvein for the PS1. And no, it's not related to the 3DO game we just took a look at. This is an overhead shmup and it's a super interesting take on the genre. Basically, you have a ship and you need to pick your loadout consisting of a main weapon and a secondary weapon. And once that's done, you're sent to this Evangelion UI. Man, this video has a lot of running themes, and you need to pick the various sections which will send you to an arena where you'll be fighting a group of enemies. And your goal is to reach the various map bosses, defeat them, and then take down the boss of that world. And while you can draw a straight line between yourself and the bosses, your weapons become more powered up the more cleared areas you have adjacent to you. So if you're fighting a region with just one cleared area behind you, all your weapons are level 1. But if you have 3 adjacent areas, your weapons are level 3 and much more powerful. So it sounds like it's best to just take your time and clear the whole map, right? Well, here's the thing. You see that timer over there? It's always counting down. It's counting down as you defeat enemies, and it starts counting down if you take more than 3 seconds to pick your next section. The game doesn't even have a health bar. If you get hit, you lose time instead of losing life, and by defeating bosses, you gain back some time. So the game is basically a speedrun shmup where you need to trace a straight line to the bosses, then clear as many adjacent areas as you can, as quickly as you can, and then repeat it for the next stage. And in case you're wondering, no, the time does not reset on the next level, so if you screw up on the previous level, your entire playthrough might be compromised. This is such a cool concept, and as I recorded footage for this video, I just sort of fell into a zen-like trance as I got into the groove of defeating enemies and finding the right balance between getting enough adjacent areas to power up my ship while taking as little time as possible. So yeah, if you want an interesting take on the shmup genre, this game might just be for you. Check it out if you can. And there we go! A look at several 32-bit hidden gems you most likely never played. Are there any games I missed? Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, I'd like to thank my newest Patreon supporters, including Freya Fenris, Joshua Haydorn, SK120, Alessandro Casella, Diet85, and Francis York Morgan. Thank you for helping make the channel better. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!